The address was still occupied, but according to the system, nobody had visited it in 12 years. Marcus Reed stared at the message glowing on his delivery scanner and frowned. He had been driving routes across western Pennsylvania for nearly 6 years, and he had seen plenty of strange things: abandoned farmhouses with mailboxes overflowing for months, forgotten cabins hidden deep in the woods, even old homes that looked frozen in time. But this was different. The scanner rarely displayed notes like that. The narrow road stretched ahead beneath a gray October sky, lined with maple trees whose leaves drifted lazily across the pavement. A cold breeze nudged against his delivery van as he slowed near the end of the cul-de-sac. The house sat alone at the far corner, partially hidden behind overgrown hedges. Its white paint had faded to a dull cream. The porch sagged slightly under the weight of years. Wind chimes hanging beside the front door swayed softly, creating a faint metallic melody that seemed almost lonely against the silence of the neighborhood. Marcus shifted into park and glanced at the package resting on the passenger seat. It wasn't anything special. A small cardboard box. Lightweight. The kind of delivery most people forgot about 5 minutes after opening. Yet something about the house made him hesitate. He checked the address again. Correct. As he stepped out, the cool autumn air brushed against his face. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his boots as he walked up the cracked stone pathway. Every house around it looked lived in. Fresh flower beds, cars in driveways, children's bicycles near garages. But this place felt disconnected from the rest of the world, as though time moved differently here. Marcus reached the porch and noticed something unusual. The mailbox mounted beside the door was nearly empty. Not overflowing. Not neglected. Someone was clearly collecting the mail. He raised an eyebrow. That didn't fit the note on his scanner. Before he could knock, movement caught his eye. A curtain near the front window shifted ever so slightly. Then it stopped. Marcus froze. Someone had been watching. For a brief moment, he saw the outline of a face behind the glass. Then it disappeared. The silence returned. He knocked gently. No answer. He waited. The wind chimes continued their soft song overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. He glanced back toward the street. Nothing moved. After nearly 30 seconds, he heard the faintest sound from inside. Slow footsteps. Careful footsteps. The kind that belonged to someone carrying the weight of many years. The lock clicked. The door opened only a few inches. Standing behind it was an elderly woman. Her silver hair was neatly brushed despite the early hour. A pale blue sweater hung loosely around her shoulders. Her hands rested lightly against the edge of the door. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. But it wasn't her age that caught Marcus's attention. It was her eyes. They carried a quiet sadness he couldn't quite explain. The sadness of someone who had spent a very long time waiting for something. Or someone. Delivery for Evelyn Carter, Marcus said with a polite smile. For a second, the woman simply stared at him. Not at the package. At him. As though she were trying to remember a face from another lifetime. Then something unexpected happened. Her expression softened. A tiny smile appeared. Small. Fragile. Almost disbelieving. Thank you for stopping by, she said. Her voice was gentle, warm, and strangely emotional for such an ordinary delivery. Marcus handed over the package. Of course, ma'am. Evelyn carefully accepted it. Her fingers trembled slightly against the cardboard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the trees overhead. Leaves rolled across the porch floor. Then Evelyn looked past him toward the empty street. The smile faded just a little. You know, she said quietly. It's nice to open the door and see someone standing there. Marcus felt an odd chill despite the afternoon light. There was something in the way she said it. Something deeper than simple politeness. He followed her gaze down the silent road. No visitors. No parked cars. No signs that anyone else had come by recently. Just the sound of the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. And standing there on that aging porch, Marcus suddenly had the strange feeling that this delivery might not be the reason he had arrived at this house at all. Marcus drove away from the house, but the image of Evelyn Carter standing behind that half-open door stayed with him long after the delivery was complete. He had visited thousands of homes over the years. Most people accepted packages with distracted smiles, quick thank yous, and eyes already focused on whatever came next in their day. Evelyn had looked at him differently, as if his arrival had mattered, as if the simple sound of a knock on her door had carried a significance he did not yet understand. The afternoon sun slipped lower as he continued his route. Golden lights stretched across the roads and painted long shadows across front lawns decorated for fall. Families carried grocery bags inside. Children chased one another through piles of leaves. Neighbors waved from driveways. Ordinary moments. Small moments. The kind people rarely noticed while living them. Yet Marcus found himself thinking about the quiet house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The next morning, a cold mist hovered over the town. Marcus stopped at a coffee shop before beginning his deliveries. The smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the air. He waited near the counter while local residents chatted around small tables. A retired man wearing a navy baseball cap sat beside the window reading a newspaper. Marcus glanced outside and froze for a second. Across the street stood Evelyn's neighborhood. He had not realized how close it was. The old man noticed him looking. "You work that route?" he asked casually. Marcus nodded. "Sometimes." The man folded his newspaper. "Then you have probably seen the Carter place." Marcus hesitated. "The older woman who lives there?" "That is the one." The man's expression softened. "Sad story." Marcus leaned slightly closer. "How so?" The man stared through the window for a moment before answering. "Used to be one of the most respected teachers in town. Everybody knew Mrs. Carter." Marcus listened quietly. "My daughter had her in 3rd grade. Best teacher she ever had. Patient. Kind. Remembered every student's name." He shook his head. Slowly. "Funny how people forget." Marcus frowned. "Forget?" The old man gave a small laugh, without humor. "Life gets busy. People move away. Families drift apart. Years pass." He looked down at his coffee cup. Then one day somebody realizes they have not checked on a person in a very long time. The conversation lingered with Marcus throughout the day. By late afternoon, clouds gathered overhead. A light rain began falling as he completed his final deliveries. Normally, he would head straight back to the distribution center. Instead, he found himself turning down a familiar road. The windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass as Evelyn's neighborhood appeared ahead. He told himself he was only passing through. Nothing more. But as he approached the corner, he noticed a small figure standing near the mailbox. Evelyn. She wore a beige coat and held an umbrella above her head. The rain tapped softly against the fabric. Marcus slowed instinctively. Evelyn opened the mailbox and looked inside. Empty. Her shoulders sank almost imperceptibly. Then she closed it and started back toward the house. Marcus watched something that made his chest tighten. Before reaching the porch, she turned and looked down the street one more time. Not searching for a package. Not searching for mail. Searching for someone. Anyone. The expression lasted only a second before she disappeared inside. Marcus sat motionless behind the wheel. Rain dotted the windshield. A porch light flickered on beside the front door. Warm yellow light spilled across the wet wood steps. The house suddenly looked even lonelier than it had the day before. Later that evening, Marcus could not stop thinking about what he had seen. He sat alone in his apartment eating takeout while the television played quietly in the background. Yet his attention remained elsewhere. He pictured Evelyn checking the mailbox, looking down the empty street, waiting. Around 9 o'clock, he opened his laptop and searched local school archives. It took longer than expected. Then he found an old yearbook photograph from nearly 3 decades earlier. Evelyn Carter stood in the center of a classroom surrounded by smiling children. Her hair was darker then, her posture straighter, but the smile was unmistakable, genuine, bright. The photograph included a caption beneath it. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, Elementary Education, dedicated to helping every child feel seen. Marcus stared at those final 3 words. Feel seen. Something about them echoed in his mind. He remembered what she had said when she accepted the package. "Thank you for stopping by." Then he remembered the look in her eyes when she spoke. For the first time, he began to wonder whether the woman living in that quiet house had spent years hoping someone would simply notice she was still there. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air and pale sunlight. Marcus finished his morning route earlier than usual, but instead of driving home, he found himself turning toward a small bakery near downtown. The display case glowed with warm light, showcasing fresh pies, muffins, and cinnamon rolls. The scent of butter and vanilla drifted through the shop as customers chatted quietly over coffee. Marcus stood in front of the counter longer than necessary. He was not entirely sure why he had come. Eventually, he pointed toward a small apple pie resting beneath a glass cover. "I will take that one," he said. 20 minutes later, He parked near the familiar house. The hedges looked slightly less intimidating beneath the sunshine. Golden leaves scattered across the lawn like pieces of amber glass. For a moment he sat in the truck, wondering whether this was a mistake. Maybe Evelyn would think he was intruding. Maybe she preferred being left alone. After all, most of the town seemed to believe exactly that. Yet before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped onto the porch carrying the pie. The wind chimes greeted him again with their soft metallic song. He knocked. Footsteps answered after a short pause. When the door opened, surprise immediately appeared in Evelyn's eyes. "Marcus?" she asked. He smiled awkwardly. "I was nearby." It was not entirely true. "I brought pie." Evelyn looked from his face to the box in his hands. Then something warm flickered across her expression. "Well," she said gently, stepping aside, "it would be rude to let a perfectly good pie stay outside." Marcus entered slowly. The interior of the house felt like stepping into another era. Everything was spotless. Not modern. Not fashionable. Simply cared for. Framed photographs lined the walls. Books filled wooden shelves. A grandfather clock ticked softly from the corner of the living room. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and old paper. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, painting delicate patterns across the hardwood floor. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked neglected. Yet there was an unmistakable stillness to the place. A silence built from years without visitors. Evelyn led him into the kitchen. She placed 2 plates on the table while Marcus cut slices of pie. The simple routine felt oddly natural. For a while they talked about ordinary things. The weather. The changing leaves. The bakery downtown. Evelyn laughed softly when Marcus admitted he knew almost nothing about desserts and had chosen the pie based entirely on appearance. The sound surprised him. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It made her seem years younger. As the afternoon passed, Marcus noticed details scattered throughout the house. Photographs of children holding handmade cards. Framed drawings. Graduation announcements. Letters carefully preserved behind glass. At first he assumed they belonged to family members. Then he noticed something unusual. The names were all different. Hundreds of different names. During a lull in conversation, his eyes drifted toward one particular frame resting atop a cabinet. It contained a class photograph from decades ago. Nearly 30 children smiled at the camera while a younger Evelyn stood proudly behind them. "Your students?" Marcus asked. Evelyn followed his gaze. Her smile softened. "Every year I kept one picture." She stood and walked over to the frame. Her fingers brushed lightly against the glass. "I thought it would help me remember them." Marcus looked around the room again. Suddenly he understood. The photographs were everywhere. Not dozens. Hundreds. Decades of students. Decades of lives she had touched. Evelyn returned to her chair. For a moment she seemed lost in memory. "They used to send letters," she said quietly. "Christmas cards too. Sometimes photographs of their families." Her eyes drifted toward the window where sunlight shimmered across the glass. "Life gets busy though." Marcus remained silent. Something in her voice told him there was more she was not saying. Evelyn folded her hands together. "People grow up. They move away. They build families, careers, new lives." A small smile appeared. "That is how it should be." She spoke the words kindly, but Marcus noticed the pause that followed. The silence lingered between them. Outside, leaves tumbled across the porch in the afternoon breeze. Inside, the grandfather clock continued its steady ticking. Then Marcus noticed something that made his chest tighten. Beside the refrigerator hung a calendar. Every square for the past month was completely blank. No appointments. No visitors. No reminders. Just empty white spaces stretching day after day, week after week. Evelyn followed his eyes and smiled politely. "I mostly keep it for decoration now." Marcus looked away, unsure what to say. The room suddenly felt different. Not sad exactly. Worse than sad. It felt forgotten. And sitting there surrounded by photographs of hundreds of former students, Marcus began to realize something that troubled him deeply. This woman had spent her life making sure children felt seen, valued, and remembered. Yet somehow, over the years, the world had stopped looking back. Evelyn walked Marcus to the front door as the afternoon sunlight slowly faded into the soft gold of early evening. The shadows of the maple trees stretched across the lawn, and the air carried that familiar autumn chill that arrived just before sunset. Marcus thanked her for the pie and conversation, but before stepping outside, He found himself glancing one last time at the walls covered with photographs. Generations of children, smiling faces frozen in time. Hundreds of lives that had once revolved around the woman standing quietly beside him. "You must have been an incredible teacher," he said. Evelyn smiled politely. "I was fortunate. I had wonderful students." There was no pride in her voice. No bitterness either. Just simple gratitude. Yet as Marcus drove home, he could not stop thinking about the house. The photographs. The empty calendar. The way Evelyn still checked her mailbox every day. Something did not add up. Over the next week, Marcus found reasons to pass through the neighborhood whenever his route allowed it. Sometimes he saw Evelyn watering flowers on the porch. Sometimes she sat near the front window reading a book. Other times, she simply watched the street while sunlight drifted through the curtains behind her. The more he observed, the more one question stayed with him. How could someone spend decades helping so many people and end up so completely alone? One evening, after finishing work, Marcus opened his laptop again. Rain tapped gently against his apartment window while the glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. He searched local archives, school newsletters, alumni groups, and community pages. Hours passed. Gradually, pieces of Evelyn's story began to emerge. Newspaper clippings from years ago described volunteer literacy programs she had started for struggling children. School awards recognized her dedication to students who needed extra support. One article featured a photograph of Evelyn standing beside a group of elementary students holding books. The headline read, "Teacher gives hundreds of children a love for reading." Marcus continued scrolling. Another article mentioned former students returning to thank her after graduating college. Another highlighted a fundraiser she organized for families facing financial hardship. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Everywhere he looked, Evelyn appeared in the background of someone else's success story. Helping, encouraging, supporting, never seeking attention, never taking credit. Around midnight, Marcus discovered an alumni social media page connected to the elementary school where she had taught. Thousands of former students were members. Doctors, engineers, small business owners, parents, grandparents, people living all across the country. He stared at the screen in disbelief. The community Evelyn had helped build still existed. It was thriving. Yet somehow nobody seemed aware that she was spending her days alone in that quiet house. Marcus leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Perhaps people simply assumed someone else was checking on her. Perhaps they thought she had moved away years ago. Perhaps life had become so busy that memories gradually faded into the background. None of those explanations felt entirely satisfying. Outside, rain continued tapping against the glass. Marcus found himself opening the folder of photographs he had taken during deliveries over the years. Landscapes, small towns, holiday decorations, moments that caught his attention. Then an idea began forming. Simple at first, almost ridiculous. He closed the laptop and stared into the darkness of his apartment. The next Saturday, Marcus arrived at Evelyn's house carrying coffee and fresh muffins. The morning air smelled of wet leaves and pine. Evelyn welcomed him inside with genuine warmth now. Their conversations had become easier, more natural. They talked about books, local history, favorite childhood memories, and the small changes that had transformed the town over the decades. At one point, Evelyn excused herself to refill their coffee cups. Marcus glanced toward a bookshelf and noticed several large photo albums neatly arranged beside old yearbooks. When Evelyn returned, he nodded toward them. "Do you ever look through those?" he asked. She followed his gaze. For a moment, her expression softened. "Sometimes." Marcus smiled. "Would you show me?" Evelyn hesitated briefly before carrying one of the albums to the table. As she opened the cover, dozens of photographs appeared. School plays, graduation ceremonies, holiday events, science fairs, field trips, children holding handmade cards, children standing proudly beside projects, children hugging their teacher at the end of the school year. Page after page revealed a life filled with connection. Marcus listened as Evelyn remembered names, stories, dreams, and accomplishments. Remarkably, she recalled nearly all of them. 40 years of students, and she still remembered who loved baseball, who struggled with reading, who wanted to become a nurse, who once cried on the first day of school. Marcus watched her carefully. For the first time since meeting her, he noticed something beyond the loneliness. Beneath the quiet routine, beneath the empty calendar, beneath the years of silence, There remained a deep and genuine love for every child who had ever passed through her classroom. And in that moment, Marcus realized the story was not about a forgotten woman. The story was about hundreds of people who had forgotten how much they owed the woman who helped shape their lives. That night, Marcus barely slept. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but the memory of Evelyn turning the pages of those albums stayed with him long after midnight. He could still hear the warmth in her voice as she remembered student after student, year after year, detail after detail. Names that most people would have forgotten decades ago remained perfectly preserved in her heart. Yet when he thought about the blank calendar hanging beside her refrigerator, a heaviness settled over him. By sunrise, pale orange light spilled across his apartment walls. Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside his laptop. The screen displayed dozens of tabs he had opened the night before. Alumni groups, community pages, school reunion websites, old newsletters. The faces staring back at him were older now. Gray hair had replaced childhood smiles. Careers had replaced report cards. Entire lives had unfolded since those classroom photographs were taken. Still, Marcus could not shake the feeling that somewhere among those thousands of people were individuals who would want to know the truth. He opened a blank document and stared at the blinking cursor. For several minutes, he typed nothing. Then he began writing. Not a dramatic story, not an appeal for sympathy, just the truth. He wrote about a teacher who remembered hundreds of students. A teacher whose walls were covered with photographs and letters. A teacher who still spoke about former students as though they had left her classroom yesterday. He wrote about the quiet house at the end of the cul-de-sac. He wrote about the empty calendar. He wrote about the woman who had spent a lifetime helping children feel seen. Before publishing anything, Marcus hesitated. He knew Evelyn would never ask for attention. In fact, she would probably be embarrassed by it. So he decided to keep her dignity at the center of every word. He included no sad music, no exaggerated language, no dramatic claims, only gratitude. Before hitting post, he attached a photograph he had quietly taken during his last visit. Evelyn stood near her bookshelf holding an old yearbook. Sunlight from the window illuminated her silver hair. She was smiling softly at something she had remembered. It was not a picture of loneliness. It was a picture of kindness. Marcus clicked publish and closed the laptop. He expected very little to happen. Maybe a few people would see it. Maybe a handful would remember her. Then he left for work. Hours passed. Deliveries came and went. The day unfolded normally. By lunchtime, Marcus checked his phone during a break and nearly dropped it. Hundreds of notifications filled the screen. Comments appeared faster than he could read them. One person wrote, "Mrs. Carter taught me to believe I could read when everyone else thought I was behind." Another wrote, "She bought me my first book at the school fair because my family could not afford one." Another comment simply said, "I have been looking at this picture and crying. She changed my life." Marcus stared in disbelief. The responses continued pouring in. Former students tagged classmates. Classmates tagged siblings. Parents tagged children. Memories spread from one person to another like ripples across water. Throughout the afternoon, stories appeared from different states, different decades, and completely different walks of life. Yet they all carried the same theme. Evelyn Carter had mattered, more than anyone realized. That evening, Marcus stopped by her house as he often did on Saturdays. The sky glowed pink and gold above the treetops. A cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the neighborhood. Evelyn welcomed him inside with tea and oatmeal cookies. She seemed unaware that anything unusual was happening beyond her front door. They talked about books, about the changing seasons, about a robin that had built a nest beneath her porch. Years ago, Marcus listened carefully, carrying a secret he was not yet ready to reveal. Then, as the conversation drifted into a comfortable silence, Evelyn looked toward the photographs lining the walls. "Do you know something funny?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head. Evelyn smiled. "People think teachers change lives because of what they teach." Her eyes rested on one faded class picture. But most of the time, the important part is simply showing up. Being there. Letting a child know they matter. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. Outside, the evening light grew softer. Inside, the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Neither of them knew it yet, but all across the country, hundreds of people were reading his post. Hundreds of people were remembering the woman who had once made them feel important. And for the first time in many years, the silence surrounding Evelyn Carter's life was beginning to break. The following morning arrived wrapped in silence. A thin layer of fog drifted across the neighborhood as dawn painted the sky in shades of silver and pale blue. Evelyn stood in her kitchen holding a warm mug of tea, watching the first light touch the maple trees outside her window. It was a routine she had followed for years. The same chair, the same view, the same quiet beginning to another day. Yet something felt different. Not outside. Inside. Somewhere deep within her chest, there was a feeling she could not quite explain. Over the previous weeks, Marcus had become part of her routine. His visits had introduced small pockets of warmth into days that had once blended together. She found herself wondering when he might stop by next. The thought made her smile. Across town, Marcus sat in his apartment staring at his phone. Notifications continued arriving faster than he could read them. Thousands of comments now filled the post. Former students shared photographs from elementary school. Others uploaded scanned report cards with handwritten notes from Evelyn. Some posted stories about difficult childhoods that had been made easier because of one teacher who believed in them. One woman wrote that Evelyn had helped her overcome a severe fear of reading aloud. Another explained that a simple conversation after class had inspired him to become a teacher himself. Story after story appeared. Memory after memory surfaced. Marcus spent hours reading them. By noon, tears had filled his eyes more than once. The remarkable thing was not how many people remembered Evelyn. It was how vividly they remembered her. They remembered encouragement spoken decades earlier. They remembered kindness shown during difficult moments. They remembered feeling noticed, seen, valued. As the afternoon sun brightened the town, Marcus drove to Evelyn's house. He carried no packages, no plans, only a quiet desire to spend time there. When Evelyn opened the door, she immediately noticed something different about him. "You look thoughtful today," she said with a gentle smile. Marcus laughed softly. "Maybe I am." They spent the afternoon organizing old photographs. Boxes that had remained untouched for years slowly opened across the dining room table. Dust floated through beams of golden sunlight pouring from the windows. The house smelled faintly of old paper, cedar wood, and cinnamon from the cookies cooling in the kitchen. For hours, neither felt the need to rush. They simply sat together turning pages. At one point, Evelyn discovered a faded letter tucked between two albums. The paper had yellowed with age. Carefully unfolding it, she adjusted her glasses and began reading silently. Her expression changed. First surprise, then tenderness, then something deeper. Marcus watched quietly. "What is it?" he asked. Evelyn looked down at the letter and smiled. "A student wrote this when he was 9. She handed it to him. The handwriting was uneven and slightly crooked. The message was simple. "Thank you for helping me when I thought I was stupid." Marcus swallowed hard. The words felt powerful precisely because they were so honest. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the album. For several moments, neither spoke. The grandfather clock ticked steadily from the living room. Outside, a breeze stirred leaves across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, birds called from the trees. The world felt unusually still. "Do you ever regret teaching?" Marcus asked quietly. Evelyn seemed surprised by the question. She looked toward the photographs covering the walls. Hundreds of faces smiled back at her from different decades of life. "Not for a single day," she answered. Her voice carried complete certainty. "Even now?" Marcus asked. Evelyn nodded. "Especially now." She rested her hands gently atop the album. "Life is strange. People come and go. Sometimes they forget to stay in touch. Sometimes they think there will always be more time." Her eyes drifted toward the window where sunlight shimmered against the glass. But that does not erase what mattered. The room fell silent again. Warm afternoon light bathed the photographs, the bookshelves, and the old wooden furniture in a golden glow. For the first time, Marcus realized Evelyn was not measuring her life by who had failed to visit. She was measuring it by the lives she had touched. And while she sat there surrounded by memories, completely unaware of what was happening beyond her front door, more and more former students continued discovering his post. More and more people continued sharing stories. The wave was growing larger by the hour. Somewhere across the country, strangers were booking flights. Others were making phone calls. Others were searching through old photo albums and yearbooks. And though Evelyn could not yet see it, Something extraordinary had already begun moving quietly toward the little house at the end of the street. 3 days later, the first sign arrived in the form of a letter. It was a cool Thursday morning. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains as Evelyn sorted through the small stack of mail she had collected from her mailbox. Most days brought advertisements, utility statements, or community newsletters. Nothing unexpected, nothing personal. But today, one envelope stood out immediately. The handwriting on the front was uneven and slightly shaky. Her name was written carefully in blue ink. Evelyn frowned softly. She did not recognize the return address. Sitting at the kitchen table, she opened the envelope with gentle hands. A single folded page slid out. As her eyes moved across the words, something changed in her expression. Marcus happened to arrive 20 minutes later carrying coffee from a nearby cafe. He knocked twice before entering. "Good morning," he called cheerfully. Evelyn looked up from the table. Her eyes glistened slightly behind her glasses. In her hands was the letter. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think you should read this." He sat across from her and accepted the page. The letter was from a man named Daniel Brooks. 40 years earlier, he had been one of her students. He wrote about struggling with reading, about feeling invisible in class, about believing he would never amount to much. Then he described the afternoon Evelyn had stayed after school to help him sound out words from a simple storybook. According to the letter, that small act had changed everything. Daniel eventually became a lawyer. He now lived in Arizona with children of his own. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stood out. "I am ashamed it took me this long to say thank you." Marcus looked up slowly. Evelyn smiled through tears she had not attempted to hide. Before either could say much more, a knock echoed through the house. Both turned toward the front door. Visitors were rare enough to make the sound feel unusual. Evelyn stood and walked toward the entrance. Outside stood a woman in her early 50s holding a bouquet of yellow flowers. The moment their eyes met, the woman's face crumpled with emotion. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked. Evelyn stared for a second. Then recognition slowly appeared. "Rebecca?" The woman laughed through tears and nodded. What happened next was simple and beautiful. They stood on the porch talking for nearly an hour. Rebecca had driven nearly 3 hours after seeing a post online. She spoke about how Evelyn had helped her through the loss of her father when she was 10 years old. She described classroom conversations she had never forgotten. Before leaving, she hugged Evelyn tightly and promised to return soon. After Rebecca drove away, the house felt strangely different. Lighter somehow. Brighter. As though fresh air had entered rooms that had been closed for years. Yet the surprises were only beginning. The next morning brought 2 more letters, then a phone call, then an email sent through an old-school alumni association. By Saturday, a steady stream of messages arrived throughout the day. Some came from nearby towns. Others came from across the country. Former students shared photographs, memories, and stories Evelyn had not heard in decades. Several admitted they had assumed she moved away years ago. Others confessed they had often thought about her, but never reached out. One message simply read, "You mattered more than you know." Evelyn read every word carefully. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she laughed. Occasionally she wiped away tears. Marcus watched it all unfold from the corner of the living room. He never mentioned the post. Not yet. He wanted the attention to belong entirely to her. By Sunday afternoon, the dining room table was covered with letters, cards, and photographs. Sunlight spilled across the growing collection. The house that had once felt silent now buzzed with activity. The telephone rang so often that Evelyn began laughing whenever it started again. Yet the most remarkable moment came just before sunset. Evelyn sat quietly by the window, holding one of the letters in her lap. Outside, the sky glowed orange and pink behind the trees. The neighborhood looked peaceful, timeless. For several minutes, she simply stared out at the fading light. Then she turned toward Marcus. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I thought people had forgotten." Marcus felt his chest tighten. Evelyn looked down at the stack of letters surrounding her. Hundreds of memories. Hundreds of lives reconnecting. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile he had seen during their first meeting. Not the brave smile she wore through lonely years. This smile was different. It carried relief, hope, and something that had been missing for a very long time. The feeling that she still belonged somewhere. Neither of them knew it yet, but the messages filling her home were only the beginning. Because while Evelyn sat surrounded by letters and memories, plans were quietly taking shape all across the country. And very soon, those plans would bring far more than words to her front door. The following week passed in a blur of letters, phone calls, and unexpected memories. Every day seemed to bring another reminder that the world had not forgotten Evelyn as completely as she once believed. Yet even as the messages continued arriving, she had no idea that something much larger was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Marcus knew, but he guarded the secret carefully. It had started with a simple suggestion buried deep within the thousands of comments. One former student had written, "We should all go see her." Another replied, "I would drive across the country if I had to." Within hours, dozens of people agreed. Then hundreds. What began as a conversation turned into a plan. Former students connected through alumni groups. Old classmates reached out to one another after decades of silence. Schedules were rearranged. Flights were booked. Hotel rooms were reserved. People who had not spoken in 20 years suddenly found themselves united by one shared purpose. They wanted to thank the woman who had helped shape their lives. On a crisp Saturday morning, Marcus arrived at Evelyn's house earlier than usual. The sky was bright blue, and golden leaves drifted lazily across the lawn. Evelyn greeted him with her usual smile and invited him inside. She noticed immediately that he seemed nervous. "You look like you are hiding something," she said playfully. Marcus laughed. "Do I?" Evelyn narrowed her eyes with mock suspicion. "Absolutely." Before she could ask another question, a knock echoed through the house. Both turned toward the front door. Evelyn smiled. Another visitor. That no longer seemed unusual. She walked toward the entrance and opened the door. A man stood on the porch holding a small bouquet of white daisies. He appeared to be in his 60s. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the man's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Carter," he whispered. Evelyn stared at him. Confusion slowly gave way to recognition. "Michael?" she asked softly. The man nodded. "You taught me in 1978. Evelyn pressed a hand against her chest. Before she could respond, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Then another. And another. She stepped onto the porch as more people began arriving. Some carried flowers. Some carried photographs. Some carried nothing except emotion written across their faces. The driveway filled quickly. The quiet street that had spent years sitting nearly empty suddenly came alive with movement. Evelyn looked around in disbelief. Faces appeared from every direction. Older faces now. Different hairstyles. Different voices. Different lives. Yet one by one she recognized them. Former students. Parents. Former colleagues. Children she had once encouraged during difficult moments. Adults she had once comforted after bad days at school. The years seemed to disappear. Tears streamed freely down many cheeks. Laughter mixed with crying. Stories overlapped. Names were spoken. Memories resurfaced. Someone brought out a photograph from a class trip taken nearly 40 years earlier. Another person produced a report card Evelyn had signed. One woman carried a children's book Evelyn had gifted her during second grade. Through it all, Evelyn stood speechless. The woman who had spent years believing she had been left behind suddenly found herself surrounded by proof that her life had mattered in ways she never fully understood. Marcus remained quietly near the edge of the crowd, watching. The autumn sunlight illuminated the scene with a warm golden glow. Leaves danced across the yard. The air carried the sounds of conversation, laughter, and reunion. Then Evelyn finally turned toward Marcus. In that instant, she seemed to understand. Not every detail, not the full story, but enough. Her eyes met his across the crowd. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Marcus simply smiled. Evelyn's hand rose slowly to her mouth as fresh tears filled her eyes. Around her stood dozens of people whose lives she had touched. More cars continued arriving at the end of the street. More visitors continued walking toward the house. And for the first time in many years, the little home that had known so much silence was overflowing with something far stronger than loneliness. It was overflowing with gratitude. The gathering continued long into the afternoon. The little house that had once seemed suspended in silence now echoed with conversations, laughter, and memories carried across decades. Folding chairs appeared on the lawn. Neighbors brought homemade desserts. Someone set up a long table beneath the maple trees. Children played near the sidewalk while their parents shared stories about classrooms from years gone by. The autumn sun drifted slowly across the sky, casting warm golden light over everything. Evelyn moved through the crowd at an almost impossible pace for someone her age. Every few minutes, another familiar face appeared. Another memory returned. Another story resurfaced. She listened to former students describe careers, families, grandchildren, and lives that had unfolded far beyond the walls of her classroom. Some had become teachers. Others had become doctors, mechanics, nurses, business owners, and community leaders. Yet despite the different paths they had taken, they all seemed to carry one thing in common. They remembered her kindness. As afternoons softened into evening, a man stepped forward holding a large photo album. He opened it carefully and placed it in Evelyn's hands. Inside were messages collected from hundreds of former students who could not attend in person. Page after page contained photographs, letters, and handwritten notes. Evelyn slowly turned each page. Tears filled her eyes again and again. One message read, "You were the first person who believed I could succeed." Another said, "You taught me that being kind mattered more than being popular." Another simply read, "Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did." The crowd gradually grew quiet as people watched her read. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes sang softly from the porch. The sounds blended together into something peaceful, something timeless. Marcus stood near the back of the gathering, content to remain unnoticed. He watched Evelyn close the album and press it gently against her chest. For several seconds, she could not speak. Then she looked around at the faces surrounding her. The faces of children she once taught. The faces of adults they had become. The faces of people who had returned because one teacher had changed their lives in ways she never fully understood. "I thought I was the lucky one," she said quietly. The crowd listened. "I spent my life surrounded by extraordinary children. Watching them grow was the greatest gift I ever received." Her voice trembled slightly. "I never expected anything in return." Tears glistened in countless eyes throughout the crowd. Evelyn smiled softly. "But today you have given me something I will never forget." The silence that followed felt sacred. No applause. No speeches. No dramatic moment. Just people standing together beneath the fading light, sharing a simple truth. Kindness leaves marks that time cannot erase. As the sun slipped below the horizon, strings of small lights began glowing around the yard. Warm golden bulbs illuminated faces, tables, and photographs. The air cooled. Conversations softened. Families lingered. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Later that evening, after most visitors had gone home, Evelyn sat quietly on the porch. The night sky stretched above the neighborhood, clear and filled with stars. The yard was finally still again, but it no longer felt empty. Several bouquets rested near the front steps. Cards and letters filled baskets beside the door. The porch light cast a gentle circle of warmth across the wooden boards. Marcus sat beside her. For a long time neither spoke. They simply listened to the distant sound of crickets and the whisper of leaves moving in the dark. Finally, Evelyn looked down the quiet street. The same street she had watched for years. The same street where she had once waited and wondered if anyone remembered. A peaceful smile touched her face. "You know," she said softly, "for the first time in a very long while, tomorrow feels different." Marcus nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. They sat together in comfortable silence. The porch light glowed warmly behind them. The wind chimes stirred once more. And there, beneath a sky full of stars, surrounded by proof of a life well lived, Evelyn Carter no longer looked like someone who had been forgotten. She looked like someone who had finally been found.